Z-Touch is a regular part of operating the Shaper Origin handheld CNC router, my favorite tool. Z-Touch is how you tell the router bit where the top of the workspace is, so the router bit can then, cut the right depth of cut. It's normally really easy. It's automatic. You hit a button, it Z-Touches, yay, you're done. But if you're using small router bits, teeny tiny router bits, you've got to use a manual process for the Z-Touch. That's a little bit harder, and my results have been inconsistent. So I made a gadget that help me make manual Z-Touch easier. I'm going to show you why you might want to make this beast and how to make it. I'm calling this thing the Z-Touch plate, and if you think it looks like overkill, I think you're 90% right. Most of the time you just don't need this. An automatic Z-Touch is all you need. But I'm making some intricate inlays, kind of trying to do some really detailed inlays like that. And I'm using a really tiny router bit, a really tiny tapered router bit. And so I can't use an automatic Z-Touch because the bit's too teeny tiny at the top. And with a manual router bit, it's all too easy to kind of not get it exactly right. It might dig into the wood a little bit and have a starting point that's going to result in a little bit too deep of a cut, or maybe you're a little bit shy and so it's too shallow of a cut. And if you're using a tapered bit, that's a real problem because your Z-Touch doesn't just set the depth of cut, it also sets the width of cut. The deeper you cut, the wider that cut is. And that's really critical for doing these tapered bit inlays. The Z-Touch plate is built around this plate of flat aluminum. I used 1/2 inch aluminum just because I couldn't easily find 1/4 inch. And I think 1/8 of an inch might have been just not quite stable enough. So it's sort of overkill, this big, thick, heavy 1/2 inch. It's built around this little LED light here. The idea being that when you put your Shaper Origin right here to do its Z-Touch, you're going to have an LED inside the opening of the Shaper Origin that's going to illuminate your bit. So it just plugs in via USB. Press down a bit to do a manual Z-Touch. When you get right to the end, that bit's going to cast a shadow. And that's going to make it possible to see, get that fly out of my face. And that's going to make it possible to see, right when that bit is touching down for a perfect Z-Touch. I've got links in the description for the parts for this thing. You'll need this aluminum plate. It's nominally 8 by 12. It's actually a different size than that. I forget what it was. It was a little shy of 8 by 12. And my guess is these things vary in size, so you're probably going to have to adjust that opening for it. You need an LED that runs off of 5 volts because that's what USB gives you, and then you need a way to plug it into a USB-A opening like the Shaper Origin has. If you shop better, you could probably find one that's already pre-wired, but I had to solder some together. I'm terrible at soldering. So basically what you're going to do here is I've got 2 sheets of plywood on it. There's an upper sheet. I used 1/2 inch, and you want to use the same thickness of ply as your plate, right? So mine was 1/2 inch. And then whatever on the back. I used 3/4 because I had 3/4 sitting around here. So what you're going to do is cut an opening just like you're making an inlay to pop that sheet into. You have a little hole here for relief for the wire to come out, and then you got some little dog bones at the corners just to make the thing fit. I've got, in the Shaper Hub project, I've got a file for this, and like I say, you're probably going to have to use offsets to make your plate fit. I tried to make the plate fit snug so it wouldn't fall out under normal use. But if you look on the back here, I've got some holes that if I ever have to poke the thing out, it'll be pretty convenient to do that. If I ever need to change the LED, for example, if it goes bad or my soldering goes bad, that's probably what's going to happen.
When the Shaper Origin is sitting on the aluminum plate, the LED is supposed to be at the right side of the opening of the Shaper. I used a 3/8 inch cobalt drill bit with some cutting oil. The placement for the hole is listed in the Shaper Hub project for a Generation 1 Shaper Origin, and you might have to modify that slightly for a Generation 2. I used a Dremel and some sandpaper to smooth the edges of the aluminum. The bottom sheet of plywood needs a slot to route the wires for the LED. I'm using the holes in the upper sheet of plywood and the aluminum plate to mark the location for the slot. I measure the location for the slot, and I'm going to use the Shaper Origin's on-tool design to cut the slot. The slot's going to be 1/8 of an inch deep and a little more than 1/8 of an inch wide to make it convenient to cut with a 1/8 cutter. The bottom sheet of plywood has a couple finger holes that can be used to push the aluminum plate out in case the LED needs to be serviced. I used on-tool design to make those holes. I soldered the wires from the LED to the USB connector and used some heat shrink tubing to make sure they were well insulated. And it works! The LED wire sits in that little slot. This shows how I laid the LED flat on the aluminum surface so the beam's going to point towards the router bit. I held it in place with some hot glue, figuring that's going to be enough to hold it but make it removable if I need to service the LED. And I added some hot glue to the back as well. I didn't want the hot glue to stand proud of the aluminum plate on the back, so I carefully shaved away the excess, making sure that I moved that scalpel away from the wires. This shows how those LED wires run over to the side, and those are going to fit in that groove I cut on the bottom plywood plate. And you're going to see some grooves, just some superfluous grooves on the bottom plywood plate. Those are just a prototyping error. You can ignore them. There's those grooves right now. Those don't mean anything. Once I got the plywood plates lined up and those LED wires are nestled in that groove that we cut, I'm just going to hold the things together with some brads while the glue dries. Yay, it still works. The shaper origin needs to see shaper tape at the start of the Z-Touch process, so I added a few rows of shaper tape and covered them with some clear packing tape. I scanned it and saved a dedicated workspace, but honestly I don't really know if that's strictly needed.
Our Z-Touch demonstration is going to be with this teeny tiny bit. This is, I think the end of this thing is a 1/4 of a millimeter radius, so it's a teeny tiny end on this tapered bit. And obviously not something you can do a manual or an automatic Z-Touch on, but we're going to show you how it works with a manual Z-Touch. All right, so in a manual Z-Touch, I'm going to lower that bit. And there I can see the shadow just coming in right as the bit touches. That's not quite touching, and with one little click, I think that's now touching. That's too far. Yeah, I can tell that's too far. When I move it back and forth, I can see the bit bending a little bit, so it's too far. That's not deep enough because I can see that shadow is not quite touching. There we go. I think that's it right there. That's what I'm going to call a good Z-Touch. That's it for this little, but hopefully somewhat useful project. If you liked the video, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button. Subscriptions are welcome, and most of all, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Hope to see you back here soon. Bye.